Summer Institute in Digital Literacy presents Tisha Lewis Ellison, Debunking Stereotypes, Humanizing Relationships Within Families' Digital Literacy Practices.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I am going to try to get started and share my screen here. Let's see. Uh-oh. Okay. Can we all
That looks perfect. Perfect.
All right. Oh, wait a minute. Something is cutting off here. Bit of a type A. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm really excited to be here to celebrate, this 8th annual Summer Institute in Digital Literacies Conference. I want to thank Renee and Julie so much for this amazing opportunity and invitation to talk and share portions of my work. So there are like 3 components of my work that I'm going to be talking about. And even in the midst of 4.5 months of being in this pandemic, and in the midst of this nation trying to heal and reflect upon the many centuries of hatred and racism and violence upon people of color, namely African Americans, I'm going to focus on family literacy, digital literacies, and relationships, okay, that are developed therein, in particular, humanizing relationships among families, adolescents, and people who don't really look like us and who don't share the same ideologies. And so I believe that this talk is going to meet you where you are as a faculty, a teacher, administrator, librarian, digital media expert, as a parent, and the other many facets of who you are. So I want to start with a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it says, "An individual who has not started living until he or we can rise above the narrow confines of his or our individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." Now, I chose this quote because I really think that sometimes we need to do a check-in with our own humanity from time to time. And I think that we need to choose whether we're going to focus our lives, focus on only our lives, meaning only our own selfish agendas, or if we're going to choose to focus on the humanity of others. Now, I think it's also important that I share a little bit about myself, my identities, the things that I'm intersecting with, the things that that are overlapping with who I am, and really why I'm doing this talk. I'm a native Washingtonian. I am a wife. I am a former Title I reading, writing skills teacher, former reading specialist. I'm currently a teacher, educator, and associate professor at the University of Georgia. And I'm a Black woman, right? But before I ventured into academia, I really have to say, like, my first love was communications, like journalism. I just knew for a fact that I was going to be the executive producer of the Oprah Winfrey Show. But I even contacted her after I graduated, and she didn't call me back. So I just shifted and did other things. I interned and worked at local TV and radio and cable stations like BET, CNN, NPR. I worked for the Black Press. I was a campus radio host, and I am a self-taught photographer. And so my love for family literacy is it's just so great. It comes from my own family, right? So I'm the daughter of Tom and Lucille Lewis, and I have been so challenged by the area of family from last year to today because my mom, she passed in November of 2019. And I mean, as I'm just dealing with the tragedy, the grief, and the trauma of what had happened, you know, and how both of my parents were in hospice care, like side by side, the hospital beds are together and caring for them, and that my dad is currently still in hospice care in another state. It's very difficult to discuss and to talk about the families that I am actually engaging with and researching without talking about my own family, and processing family at this time. And so if something triggers in this presentation where I start tearing, you know, I'm just gonna let the tears go, and I'm not gonna apologize because the last time I checked, I'm human. And so this is just a very critical time in my life. But I have had the pleasure of interviewing some of my family members, especially those in my immediate family. And as you see here, my grandmother, my late grandmother, Grandma Cherry, right? 3 weeks before she passed in Alabama, we all went to visit her. And she would talk to me about how she learned how to read and write. And she showed me how to bake cookies from scratch. And she talked to me about how, you know, her and my grandfather had these acres of land, which they still do. And so I learned a lot about myself and about my parents through her history and through their histories that have given me some resiliency at this moment. And then I've also interviewed and observed my 3 nephews, whom you see here, and they were all engaging in some form of a digital literacy practice. So the oldest was on Facebook uploading photos. The youngest, or the middle rather, was on his laptop participating in the skateboarding game, and the youngest had a handheld video game. And I was watching them, you know, I was watching their nonverbal and verbal cues and gestures and how they were creating and producing and trying to make meaning of the digital tools that they were choosing. And I became really fascinated and very curious about what other families might be doing as well. And so for over 12 years, I've been focusing on research on African American families and adolescents' use of digital tools. And up until recently, I've been looking at African American and Latinx girls' STEM literacy practices to see how they're making sense of the digital tools in their lives, and to see how race has also played a role in their digital choices. So throughout this talk, I'm going to share a few studies that I feel are really important to talk about as we're thinking about humanizing relationships, and at times the dehumanizing relationships that can enter into the work that we do. So in this picture here, you see a father from one of my studies, right? And he's engaging in an activity with his 4 children, and they're getting ready to create Christmas ball lights, right? And so you see that one of the sons is on the laptop, and he is looking up websites to share the instructions with the rest of the family. And so as I begin to think about this construct of family literacy, I go back to Denny Taylor, who wrote Family Literacy, Young Children Learning to Read and Write back in 1983. And she said that like there is no single narrow definition of family literacy that can do justice to the richness and complexities of families, right? And I actually agree with her, because how can we, as, fill in the blank, tell someone how they should engage with their children, or what they need to do with their children in the privacy of their home. And so I'm sure that during this pandemic, for those of you who are working but also have children, and you're doing some version of a homeschooling activities with your children, if we were recording your home practices, what would they look like, right? And so I guess if we have to have a definition of understanding family literacy, would be, how families choose to engage in literacy practices, whether you're reading or cooking with one another, creating a digital app or a TikTok video. But I think that it's really important that we are careful in how we're thinking about how families are what families are doing and how those practices are valid, right? So when I think about digital literacies, I think about my nephews. I think about digital literacies like this marriage of the digital tools and the literacies, like these multiple and interactive practices that are mediated by technological tools, like video games, digital stories, cell phones, laptops, that involve reading, writing, language, and exchanging information in online environments. And so when I think back and looking at my nephews, and how excited I got looking at them and looking at how they were trying to make sense of these digital tools. And I also get excited about the tools that I engage in as well, and how I choose to interact in ways that I would not have normally done so. And also, I look at how I have been engaging with these tools alone, but also together with other people at the same time, kind of like what we're doing right now, and how we're coming together. These digital tools have brought us together in ways in which we can read and write, collaborate, exchange information and ideas. So if you look at this picture here on the right, this collage, I mean, you see the many different ways in which these digital tools are entangling us, right? And I use that word intentionally because that has become the buzzword, entanglement, from Jada Pinkett Smith, right? And so, but we see how we're having this relationship with these digital tools and how it's helping us make sense of our lives somehow. And then I think about this term of humanizing and how it is very important. It's a key component in the work that I do and the work I think about for myself. So San Pedro and Kinloch, they state that humanizing relationships are very significant because the stories that we engage in, they exchange, they're significant because the stories we engage in, they serve as a medium through which knowledge is shared and relationships are sustained. So to humanize, it involves critical listening, it involves dialogic engagements, or engaging, centering relationships with and among other people. It also provides for multiple voices and perspectives and stories to move us toward social justice. So if that is humanizing, then dehumanizing is just the opposite, to take away someone's right to be a human being, or to think less of that person and to treat that person like an object. So as I reflect on how academia has perceived my work, I highlight one of the brilliant families that I had the amazing opportunity to work with, and that is Lanae, who's a mom, and her son, Gerard. She is outstanding, an outstanding woman, and parent. And she taught me about agency and how she used these digital tools to help her cope with her life, as she had been physically, emotionally, and sexually abused as a child and an adult. And she was also born with a rare skin disease, so that the same skin disease that took the life of her younger sister. So here you see, she's showing me, she's gladly showing me how she would disassemble and assemble a central processing unit, and we know it as a CPU. And she's doing this like just because she knows every part of the CPU from the motherboard. And she's just like sharing this information to me. She took a class one time, and this is what she knows how to do. And so Gerard, her son, would get on Sims 2, the video game, the computer game, and produce all kinds of virtual worlds and people. He would create a comic strip, and then he would transfer it to the digital just because he could, right? He taught himself how to do that. And then collectively, Lane created a blog for me and her son so that we could have another outlet to share our digital literacy practices and whatever else we wanted to share. I think it's important to say that I never asked Lane to do this. I never asked her to create a blog. She chose to do that by herself on her own. And so when I enter into their home, I'm always the student. You know, of course, I'm researching them, but I'm researching with them. So I'm constantly putting on and off the researcher student hat, and I'm learning about their rich and complex literacy practices in the home. So there have been times in which I've attended literacy conferences, and for instance, Lane would text, and I am her son in the same room at the same time, less than about 2 feet away from one another. And sometimes, like, I would be presenting, and my colleagues in the audience would laugh, right? And I didn't stop my presentation to ask them why they were laughing, but you know, I'm thinking maybe this is new for them. They've never heard this before. They've never participated in doing this with a family member or someone else, and how they might need to be open in how they're using the digital tools in their lives, right? And so I asked Gerard, hey, you know, why are you texting or IMing your mom in the same room with her? And he said, I text because it's a way for me to be with my mom. And I asked Lane the same question, and she said, well, you know, we text to stay connected and spend time with each other without interfering in each other's space. So as you see in this photo here, this is the back of Gerard, his head, and he's actually creating his digital comic strip. And Lane is here. You see her hand, and you also see the cell phone here. And so see how close they are with one another, but they're choosing in multiple times to text and IM each other. So here I see that they are validating their digital spaces and their family practices together. I do want to share that at another literacy conference, I was discussing some of the amazing things that Lane has done. You know, I humanized her in this presentation. I'm showing how she's engaging with her children with the practices that I just showed a moment ago. And I remember at the end of one presentation, a woman coming to me, she was a white woman, and she walked over and handed me her book, the book that she actually wrote. And she said, hey, you know, I bookmarked some different things that you could do with Lane. And I was a little bit in shock because I'm thinking, wow, I don't think she didn't get it. Like I had spent an adequate amount of time uh, detailing humanizing practices and experiences to my audience. And so what she was saying to me, what I was hearing was that these practices in her book or these skills in her book would benefit her in some way, would benefit Lanae in some way. But really it was, I guess it was causing me to see how she was perceiving Lanae through a deficit lens. And so I thought to myself, well, why do I need to introduce some skills to Lanae when she already had the skills, When I observed Lanae and Gerard, I never introduced a new activity, but I was really intentional in focusing on the existing skills and practices that they were already doing. And so I felt that what this woman was doing was a form of dehumanizing her. In another study that I want to share is where I examined 8 African American fathers, right? And I looked at their digital literacy practices in and out of the home and how they use these digital tools and practices to see if they had an impact on their children's education. Now, this research, the DIGAFAM project, was funded by the Spencer postdoctoral program. And so as a postdoc fellow, I have the opportunity to present preliminary findings about the fathers in my poster board session. And so one time there was this woman, and she was a white woman, and she was looking at my poster board with such, I guess, awe or astonishment, surprise, shock, confusion. And she's walking up to my poster board, like basically like with her mouth open. And she's saying, you know what? I never, ever thought that a study could be done like this regarding Black fathers and Black men. And so I thought about what she said, and there's a period of offense, right? And then there's also on the other end of that, me thinking that, you know what, this is exactly why I did this work, to show a different light and how these men have been perceived, or men like them have been perceived. And so what this woman had done, she had actually allowed the influences, the negative influences by the media to tell her about Black men and Black fathers. So she chose to follow the majoritarian narratives that convinced her that she couldn't possibly see these Black men in a different light. And so these images that you see here were the images in my poster board session, and they disrupted her deficit perspective of what she thought about Black men and Black fathers. But if you look very closely at these Black fathers, right? One is reading to his girls, one is, on his phone trying to help to search for a science project with his daughter. One is a father on the computer with his son. They're looking at college scholarships. One is playing a video game with his younger son, and another one is on a video, a computer, looking at the school website to look at homework. Like these kind of things, they can challenge the understanding of a population if you're not clear in regards to who they are, right? So people like this woman and other people, it's very, very hard to humanize Black men and fathers when all you see are words like what's on this slide, and phrases and stereotypes and assumptions and biases like these about Black men and fathers that the media will continue to perpetuate, these myths about the quote unquote instability and their position in society. But once you see these photos, like you cannot unsee them. You know, they tend to be etched in your mind, like all the things that you've thought about these Black men and Black fathers, it kind of changes your understanding of them with this particular study. And you begin to see them as humans, right? You begin to see them as partners in their children's education and in their literacies. You begin to see these fathers as teachers as well as students, because they are actually learning and collaborating with their children. So overall, I think it's important to that we think about these fathers' digital literacy practices and how they could actually increase education, educational researchers' policies about the kind of deficit views that have been portrayed time and time again about these families, and that we need to have a more broader understanding to incorporate and cultivate humanizing relationships. So as we reflect, what do we learn here, if any? I want us to consider 3 questions and examples. So how do you humanize your students, your clients, your families, your students' families, and how do you know or learn what is going on in their lives? So for me, this is an introduction page to an online course that I taught in this spring, spring 2020. And so every single class, I always have this page where students can introduce themselves. So this is actually my page. And here I am, I'm showing them how I'm choosing to humanize myself. And I ask them to do the same. I ask them to share like one unique thing about themselves, right? And the fact that I love Jeopardy, I record Jeopardy, I quiz myself and my family with Jeopardy, and hopefully one day I might be on there, who knows? But I share an academic and a non-academic accomplishment. And I also shared, you know, a biggest lesson that, you know, I've learned lately. And because of the fact that my mom had just passed, this grief and trauma I was really dealing with that was gripping my heart and my soul. And so I became vulnerable. I chose to become vulnerable to my students to share what it's like in my mind as I'm processing the loss of my mom and then trying to move on and move forward without her. And then another thing I do that I learned so much from my students is that I have them to choose a song that describes who they are, or a theme song, like as they're walking down the street, what's their theme song? So I have a theme song right there for myself. And this changes quite often. So the next question deals with the engagement of parents. You know, what best practices do you use to engage with parents, your students' parents? So I attended an SD webinar, the International Society for Technology and Education, and one of the panelists shared how she had actually created a Facebook page for parents, for students' parents, instead of using progress reports. And so this practice actually transferred onto Zoom during the pandemic. And she shared that there were so many parents that used that space to not only say, hey, I'm not clear about this homework assignment, but also to communicate whatever was on their minds at that time. So for instance, here are a couple of fathers from a current study, a Dig a Dyad STEM project that I was funded for, in which I looked at the relational practices of Black fathers and their daughters engaging in STEM literacy practices. Like we taught them at this particular time we taught the fathers and the daughters how to create a digital app. And they did this app together. They worked collaboratively. But we also conducted focus groups with the fathers and the daughters separately. And so here you see a screenshot of a Zoom meeting that we had this past May, in which we were, catching up with one another. We were sharing portions of the study with each other. We were also discussing this pandemic and how these recent police killings and the protests and how they were actually understanding their worlds as a result of these incidents. And then the last reflection question is, what are you doing to grow in your knowledge of working with people from different cultures and populations? So as we think about these recent killings and the protests and what's going on with the police, how might you use anti-racist materials in your classes, in the media, when you tweet someone? What articles and books might you use to humanize people? So Ibram Kendi says that an anti-racist is one who fights against racism, who fights against the idea and the policy and the actions of racism. One who sees racial groups as equal, right? And so I'm co-hosting a monthly book club with some friends of mine, and we're reading Bettina Love's book, which is right behind me. We want to do more than survive, which is about abolitionist teaching. But because this is about my culture, I'm also challenging myself and my knowledge to learn about different cultures. So I am the dissertation chair of a Chinese doc student who you see here is Tyran. And I'm starting to read a lot about Chinese transnational youth, because that's the focus of her dissertation study. So as Black people tend to experience racism for the color of their skin, especially during this pandemic, Chinese people have experienced an enormous amount of hatred and racism and violence and discrimination, xenophobia, because they come from a different country. And so I'm learning a lot about this culture and this population that has nothing to do with me, but I'm learning because I want to know more about this. And in closing, I intentionally choose, I'm choosing this slide to remember the names as well as the faces of Black men, women, and children who have been killed by police and or vigilante violence. And I do want to mention again, as I've been mentioning in every single webinar, that Breonna Taylor's killers have still not been arrested. Thank you.
Renee,
Okay.
You're muted.
You're muted.
So sorry. So Tisha, thank you so much for that great conversation. I think we can look around the room now and invite a round of applause. Yeah, give us a shout out. There's the applause. Wow, you gave us a lot to think about. So now we're going to move into small groups to have a conversation inspired by Tisha's talk. So she left us with 3 powerful questions. She invited us to think about these 3 questions and try to apply them to our own life. So we're going to break out into groups of about 8 or 9, and this is not a moderated discussion, but we invite you to consider the use of the Back to the Future protocol. where if you choose in your group, you can speak into the future, imagining the changes you wish for your school, community, or society, and imagining they have already happened. Because as you make these personal, you recognize that you are a change agent in the future. So, Julie, I think we're ready to break up into groups. We're going to spend about 20 minutes together in small group discussion. Give me a thumbs up if you understand the task at hand. We're discussing Tisha's 3 questions. And if we choose, we can choose to speak into the future, imagining the future together, right? And I'm not seeing thumbs up. I'm waiting. Do I have thumbs up here, Tisha? You can, or Julie, you can put us into groups and I think we're gonna be ready to go.
Okay, I just posted in the chat, although it disappeared because there's so many comments. I just want to make sure one more time, everybody has access to the Pathright link where all the questions are, if you'd like that. So I'll give you 1 minute to at least copy paste that. You're not going to a separate Zoom room. I'm just going to break you into rooms right here. And so everybody ready? We'll
Wait
see
a
you
second,
back.
Julie, hold on just a second. If your screen didn't look like the screen I showed, see up at the top, it might say refresh path, right? So if your Pathright doesn't look, if you see a little note at the top that says refresh, then you'll see the questions as you're supposed to. Okay, I think we're ready to go.
Okay. And if anybody gets lost, make sure to go to the lounge. We'll see you soon.
Wonderful. So we're going to take about 15 minutes and do some large group synthesis. And then we've got some housekeeping stuff to take care of before we break you for lunch. So the first thing I'd like to do is invite you to share with us one big idea or one thing you found yourself thinking about or wondering about or reflecting on in your small group. We were 150 people. We had a lot of small group conversations. Let's see if we can pull out some of the big ideas that were most meaningful to you. And since I was only in one group, I want to call on a person in our group who I think can help reflect on some big ideas that came out. Bridget Dalton, where are you? Will you talk a little bit about one big idea that was meaningful or useful or important to you that came out of our conversation?
Sure. I think the big idea that resonated and I think connected to most of the contributions in our group was the idea that the challenges, the systemic challenges of inequity and oppression and systemic racism and such requires broken down in ways that are slow and long and painful. Yet, if we start at the permission to witness the human being, the individual story, the witnessed lived experience of everyone in our community, and learn to listen with empathy and understanding and find clever ways to give permission people to communicate who they are that keep them safe and not too vulnerable, then slowly, as we see and know one another for who we all each individually truly are, change may become, and maybe that's the future we look back at.
Wow, so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm now gonna call on Mary Kate. Isn't this cool? We're cold calling. It's a technique we use in classrooms, but it works really well for grownups. I know any one of you might be called at any time. Mary Kate, you're up next. Do you want to share
I feel
an
like
idea
one of my students, like.
Yes, indeed.
So one of the things we were talking about in terms of what we're already doing is everyone sort of contributed their ideas with regard to how they reach their students, and we had some really neat ways to do that. Some people do their, the surveys. Some people, basically it came down to relationships and fostering relationships and how we can, how you start that off and where it starts off. And some people were talking about their advisory time. I mentioned study hall. And a lot of the time it seems like those relationships are built in unstructured time. But also talking to kids about what they like, what they're doing, you know, that sort of thing. But we also had a really interesting discussion about how we can, basically how media, and this goes back to what the keynote was mentioning, how media perpetuates stereotypes and how we can use media literacy to sort of deconstruct those stereotypes. Maybe, you know, asking questions about what is the stereotype, what values are being pushed forward, what values are missing, whose voices are missing, and what we can do in our classroom to have that conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing. And that leads us next to Jamie Rue. Jamie Rue, can you identify a topic or an idea that came up in your small group discussion that was meaningful to you?
Oh, did I freeze? I think I froze. Did I freeze?
Nah, you're fine. You're fine. Just turn on your video.
I think I froze. Did I freeze?
Jamie, we can hear you.
We can hear you just fine.
Why don't you call on someone else, Renee, while we're waiting for Jamie to come back?
Okay, cool. How about Dora? Dora, what was a key idea that emerged in your small group that was meaningful to you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, one of the biggest ideas, and I think we centered our discussion around, was meeting our families where they are. So that came across various different examples. I think it was Wes who set up a website for his families for instructional support, but also students and teachers. I think Thora is going to talk a little bit more about her example with how she engaged her families, but really just meeting them where they are and with the tools that they are used to and, you know, have comfort with. Gabe shared how his art teacher went on Facebook Live. So I think that's a great starting point when we're talking about digital literacy and digital tools with our families.
Thanks so much for sharing, Dora. I'm going to call on Jamie Rue. Are we back to you now?
She's back.
Yes, Renee. Yes. Yes, Carol, thank you. Okay. We had a really good conversation around these questions. And the first was really simplistic ways to humanize our students and parents is to have know their names, eye contact, reach out on a regular basis. It does not have to be a complicated system, but it could become more complicated. But bottom line is just that voice to voice, just that greeting, the eye contact when you're conversing, things of that nature. And number two, the best practices regarding parents is, again, just that one-on-one conversation, and start out with the silver lining about their child before telling them all of the other things that children do, such as lie, steal, cheat. That's just what children do sometimes. I think I froze again.
That was absolutely beautiful. Charmaine, what's a big idea that came up in the discussion that you would like to share?
I was in Dora's group, so I could just add to what she said was, you know, we talked about, you know, providing online support for parents, and my team members shared so many of their websites that could kind of give us ideas on how to implement some of those how to log in, and also how to get parents to kind of contact us and, you know, with the help that they need. So I feel like that's another thing that we talked about in our group too.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. We're going to end this part of our synthesis activity by hearing from the two Andreas, Andrea Ellis and Andrea Kuhar. Can you share something meaningful that came up in your small group dialogue that you'd like to share?
Yes. Andrea Ellis, are you out there? Do you want to go first?
I am out there.
Okay.
I appreciate that. So we talked a lot about, I think, that humanizing part of Dr. Ellison's conversation, and grounding that in the importance of relationships, right? And so being able to really learn to know somebody on a personal level first before you start digging into some of those harder questions. So we were just kind of framing it in that way.
And I, the second Andrea, we also focused on humanizing, which I really loved this conversation, and my brain just went everywhere when we were talking about this. But we also talked about having students tell their stories from their point of view. And in my school, I did do a 12th grade memoir project, which I talked a lot, which was very powerful because that school was all African-American, like all Black students, all Black teachers except for a couple of us, and then all Black administration. So I think the compilation of those stories is something that's incredibly humanizing. And my group was very helpful in trying to help me process some things around where to go with those stories and kind of how to process that in a new environment that I'm in now that's predominantly white also.
Wow. You know what I love about that comment, Andrea, is that you really illustrated the key ideas for us to imagine the future of how we can be leaders in this space to make our schools and our societies more just and equitable. Everybody has to learn from everyone, right? And we have to use the tools we have and the knowledge we have to embrace that openness. Now, Tisha, will you give us the last word here as you offer a synthesis of the morning's experience?
I was saying just one word, or can I say more?
Please feel free to take some minutes to do a synthesis.
Yeah, I was just being funny. Just some, raw humor at 11:42. Well, yeah, I'm so glad that the breakout sessions, it sounds as though you all were having a lot of great conversations and talking about the power of relationships. Like if you are not choosing to learn, whether it's reading something new or spending time with a particular person who doesn't share the same views or viewpoints or ideologies as you're not going to grow or learn. I'm going to say, even for myself, like participating in the virtually viral hangouts and also doing the virus of racism with Renee, I've learned from a lot of you all this summer. And, we have to continue to think about cultivating humanizing relationships and to continue asking yourself, okay, how am I, number one, humanizing myself, and how will I choose to humanize others, my students, family members, my administrators, etc. I love the comment that I can't remember who said it, but about meeting families where they are. I mean, that is just amazing. So in my talk, when I mentioned about the person from the ISTE webinar, how she chose to have a Facebook account or a Facebook page for families, and she really just met them where they are. And in my research with the fathers, doing this Zoom talk, meeting them where they are, not giving them an agenda, but allowing them to freely talk. I learned so much about them, and the fact that we're of the same cultural background, but we're very, very different in gender and very different in how we think. So I think that's also important too. In our breakout groups, we talked about, I think it was Jen, who mentioned about being an interrupter, very key. We talked about how around the world, right, especially when terrorism attacks have happened, they say, as if you see something, say something, or if you hear something negative, racist, sexist, then say something. And so you have to, I think that getting it at that moment when you hear that racist comment, oh, you're articulate, oh, can I touch your hair? Oh, you look good for that for that kind of a person, as that kind of a person, to really just say, and I actually use this question, what do you mean by that? And I stop and I listen and I allow that person to fumble over their words, right? But I wait for them to respond, and I don't say anything until they respond. And what that does is that makes a courageous conversation happen, right? Where it's going to be very uncomfortable, and to know that there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I might say something that, oops, I shouldn't have said, or I didn't mean it in that way. Let me explain, right? And so we all have those moments, but to know that this is a journey, you know, we're dealing with, as I mentioned before, like many centuries of racism, systemic racism in this entire world. It's not going to happen by the end of this conference. I hate to say that, or the end of this year, but it's got to be a continued seeking of ourselves, like first of all, of ourselves, of our own heart. And to say, oh my gosh, let me stop saying that I am not a racist, but let me look at some of the practices that I have partaken in. Another thing is that I mentioned about having, for those who are working with other teachers, to have them focus on their own literacy histories. A lot of teachers, like white teachers, think that they don't have a culture. Yes, you do. You do have a culture. And so to start with yourself, to start with your history, to start with how you grew up. Like in my class, I always, like the very first assignment, aside from the introduction that I mentioned in my presentation, is that I have them to create a digital story. I call it a multimodal literacy autobiography, and they have to share something about themselves, how they learned to read or write, how they engaged with their families, how they became a teacher, or the thought of becoming a teacher. So they have to expose some vulnerable parts of themselves, and then we begin to talk about that throughout the semester. Another thing too is that remember, we have to deprogram and unlearn a lot of the things that maybe we've said, things that we've heard, things that we've seen that we didn't really interrupt, right? And so there's a lot of going back to that. So when we're in faculty meetings and we hear something, I don't think, well, I think maybe you might want to choose your battles, but I don't think that you should allow that person to just get off and just say, well, maybe they didn't mean this, fill in the blank. We don't know that, because you don't know what's in their mind. So I think that either you're doing it in the meeting, or you're approaching that person by themselves and saying, hey, when you said this at the meeting, what did you mean by that? Because I took it in a very interesting way, and I want to address it, and I want you to know, so that we can cultivate relationships. And another thing too is, I think that's it. The last thing I want to say, and I'm just going to always say this wherever I have a platform, is that Breonna Taylor, who was killed in Kentucky, her killers have still not been arrested. What are we going to do about that?
Beautiful. Thank you so much for those closing remarks. And let's give us all a round of applause. Tisha, thank you for inspiring such a productive and helpful dialogue. That was powerful learning experience. Now, you know, our friend Troy Hicks has taught us something, and we've learned it really well. We like to use a little reflective writing to close out this session. So I'm pointing you down to the bottom of the page where we started our morning, and we're going to invite you to spend 3 minutes making a reflective comment in response to this question. Why is it important to humanize students and parents from different cultures and populations? You can see that people have already started their reflective writing process. Just you put your answer right there. We're going to give you 3 minutes of quiet time to write. Everybody understand the task at hand? 3 minutes of quiet writing now. Okay, thanks so much for, you can complete your reflection. Kara, I'm hoping that you can offer us a little bit of expectation about, boy, that was a fantastic morning, but there's more to come. Help us understand what's going to be happening next and what we need to know.
Sure. Actually, what I'd like to do first is turn it over to Ryan. And then Ryan, if you'll pass it back to me, I'll close out.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Kara. So thank you, everyone. I just wanted to point out a couple opportunities that you have based on Tisha Lewis Ellison's awesome talk. We also have opportunities to engage with our CPS scholars today, who are teachers in Chicago Public Schools. And I just wanted to point you towards some great resources to further these conversations. So first of all, there's Virtually Viral today. And the topic of that is going to be, it's going to feature 5 of our CPS scholars, Nicole Lewis Dickens, LaDwanda Hill, Kiviana Ray Smith, Jeanette Alfred, and Jamie Rue. And they're going to be talking about how digital literacy intersects with issues of racial justice in public education, which is a perfect topic to follow up with Dr. Ellison's keynote. And then at 6 to 7 Eastern, we actually have a panel focused around equity called Rising to the Challenge, the Education Our Students Need Now. And that features LaDwanda Hill, Danielle Williams, and then several of our other panelists, which you'll be able to see. I'm going to put a link in the chat and also share my screen for just a second, because our panelists made videos. Let me just make sure I get the right link here. There we go. Copy and paste. There's the link to the path, and I'll share my screen. And our panelists made videos. So if you engage in our Anytime content, you'll be able to see videos of our panelists, Courtney, Danielle, Erica, and LaDwanda talking about the biggest equity issues that they see facing students in their work. And you can respond to them via Padlet anytime, even if you're not able to join us this evening. So I invite you to engage with those resources, and then I'm going to turn it back to Kara.
Thanks, Ryan. All righty. So the first reminder that I have for you is to please refresh your Pathwrite on a regular basis. We are behind the scenes making changes every few minutes here, so refresh. The second thing is there was a misquote about the time that Frank is performing tonight. He is performing tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern time, so adjust to your time zone. We will have the dyad partner spreadsheet ready to go at around 2 p.m. Eastern time. So check that and you'll be able to access that. We're going to just remind everybody, please use the Pathwrite, get into Wednesday's schedule, and go through and see what's happening today. So Virtually Viral happens at 1 p.m. Eastern time until 2. Hopefully you'll all be able to attend that. And then workshops and conversations begin at 2, followed by Design Studio and 6 o'clock workshops and our awesome entertainment this evening. So that's what I've got for you now. We'll be adding Zoom links to the Design Studio page as soon as we have them. Julie, type a message if there's anything that I missed. I know you can hear me. Julie's screen froze, so she's typing to me in the background. Give me a thumbs up if we're okay, Julie, or if there's anything else I need to add. She says we're all good. Awesome. All right, so thank you everybody for a wonderful session this morning. Thank you, Tisha, for your amazing keynote that brought so many thoughts to my head as I work with my students. And we will see you at Virtually Viral at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Enjoy your lunch, go for a walk, get away from your screen.
Jeanette, when you said you're not sure where to go next, go to lunch, come back either at 1 o'clock for Virtually Viral or come back at 2 for the workshops.
Oh, staff needs to meet for a faculty meeting at noon. Sorry about that, guys. You don't get to leave. Bye, Tisha. Excellent. Really great.
Good job. You were amazing. Thank you.